Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Writers Workshop. Our topic tonight is developing your writing style, and our instructor is a local author and a professor in the creative writing department at the University of Illinois. Please help me welcome back Ted Sanders.
Thank you. Is this working? Can you hear me okay? You're good? Okay, great. Apologize for the phone here. I had a couple of, I didn't want to mess with all the tech, because whenever I mess with the tech, it ends up stressing me out more, doing the projector and stuff. And I'm not very stressed out at all right now, but it always stresses me out more when I'm like, ooh, are the buttons going to work? A little bit about me. As Salim said, I'm Ted Sanders. I am, in fact, a local author. I've lived here for about 20 years and got my undergraduate degree and my master's degree, my MFA, in creative writing at the University of Illinois, and now I'm a professor in the program. But my kids have grown up here, and I've spent most of my life here now, which is kind of weird at the age of 53 to realize the town you landed in randomly is where you're now living. Anyway, we're going to talk today a little bit about developing your own personal style. And I wanted to start off, and maybe just to get a feel, the last time I did one of these was virtual. And I don't even remember how well I was able to see faces, but maybe we could go around the room, and could you just tell me your name and then tell me what kinds of things you like to write or are interested in writing? Could we do that? Maybe start up here?
Sure, my name's Rachel. I mostly do like romance, kind of fun historical fantasy things.
Yeah, cool.
I'm Ekta, and I write mostly magical realism, some women's fiction, but mostly in the magical realism.
Literary kind of stuff?
More plot-driven, but
Yeah.
there are some literary elements to it.
Yeah, that term's so loaded anyway. But yeah, how about you?
My name's Louise, and I write literary fiction.
Nice.
My name is Ari, and I write fantasy, particularly high fantasy.
Nice.
I'm Jessica, and I've been working on some historical fiction.
Cool. I'm terrified of historical fiction. Like I just don't think I could do it. I don't know. You always have stories brewing, and you're like, I wish I could do that. Maybe one day.
I'm Sheila, and I do murder mysteries.
Oh, cool. Nice.
I'm Vicki, and I also write historical fiction, 19th century.
Oh, great.
I'm Tasha, and I like to write technical, like current events, social justice, persuasive.
Like nonfiction stuff? Yeah, great.
Hi, I'm Savannah. I got my degree in journalism, so I write mostly nonfiction, like poetry, but
Cool.
mostly nonfiction.
Yeah, great.
I'm Sharon. I've never really finished a project that I've started, but I've been trying to write sci-fi, but I'm switching over to maybe some literature type stuff.
Yeah. Don't let that stop you, by the way. My cousin just a couple weeks ago introduced me to a friend of his as the king of unfinished projects. And I was like, I got 5 books. And he's like, doing me like that? Anyway, don't let that bother you. Because I kind of am, to be fair. He's kind of right. But I finished some. I finished the ones I'm most interested in.
Nicolette, I teach first grade. And
Nice.
So,
Kudos to that.
I like to model different styles of writing to my students, but mostly
Oh, nice.
here, my brother's an aspiring writer, so I'm
Nice.
here with him.
This is he.
I'm Patrick. I write mostly YA, sci-fi, fantasy.
Cool. How about in the back? Oh, that's Salim. I know who you are. Next to Salim there in the back.
She
Yeah.
does write, by the way.
Salim too. Oh. Well, you better throw your voice in the ring.
Right now, it's mainly mysteries, and I also write book reviews for the library.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I'm Skylar, and I write fan fiction.
Okay. Yeah. No. Hey, no shame. You gotta. I would encourage you to move past that, but you gotta latch on somewhere. I mean, when I have students in class all the time who write fan fiction, and my feeling about it is better to be writing than not writing, right? I mean, the worst thing you can do is not write, right? How about you?
I'm Evelyn, and also nonfiction. So it's good that there's some folks that are nonfiction. I'm very
Yeah.
technical. Like I'm doing I'm a professor. I'm doing textbook writing coaches. So
Okay.
I would love to do fiction at some point in my life.
Yeah.
I don't know what my writing style is, even though I've written.
Yeah. I don't know what mine is either. We'll get into that. Yeah.
I'm Caitlin, and I like to write the oral histories of my family. Is that nonfiction?
Oh, yeah, nice, cool. Like I said, I'm Ted. I write, as some of you might know, I write fiction and creative nonfiction. So I write, my first book was a collection of short stories. I also write essays, mostly memoir or hybrid kind of stuff, personal essay, hybrid stuff. But the main project that kind of consumed my life for about a decade was I had a 4-book series called The Keepers, which was kind of high-end middle grade, sort of Harry Potter level book series, 4-book series. And the last book came out, I don't even know when, 2018 maybe, I think was when the last book came out. And I teach all those topics too in the classroom at university. So I teach fiction, and I also teach creative nonfiction, and I teach juvenile fiction too. So hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about all those things tonight. Salam, how much time do we have? Is it 1 hour or 1 hour? Okay. Okay, cool. Cool. Yeah, because I'm just going to kind of talk. I wanted to talk just to like give everybody kind of a baseline, not so much for you to like take this to your grave or say this is gospel, but just for us to kind of facilitate our conversation here. Whenever I'm in the classroom, I always like to emphasize for my students, and this is where we'll be headed with style in a second here, to get to style. Elements of fiction. And when we talk about the elements of fiction, this is not going to be a gospel list. You can go online and you can find 10 different lists. They all have basically the same kind of stuff on them, but some lists have 5 things and some have 12. And even my list that I use has different things on it. When we're talking about elements of fiction, we're really sort of talking about things like, you can think of it as elements of a house, right? You have your beams and your studs and your joists, you have your drywall, you have your plumbing, you have your electrical, right? All these different elements of the house. And if you're going to be building a story, if you're going to be building any kind of narrative or any piece of writing, you need to be thinking about all those different aspects, right? You're not just in there to do the carpentry, you're in there to do everything. I'm using that house analogy though, and I don't love it. I mean, really a garden analogy I think is better for how I think of writing. It's more like a growing thing you're tending rather than a physical object you're building, if that makes any sense. But if you like the garden analogy more, you can see I've got several different plants going in the garden of this narrative or whatever it is I'm trying to write, and I've got to tend to all of them, but they all need different kinds of attention. So when we talk about the elements of fiction, this is kind of what we're talking about. Just basically, I'll throw one out there. One of the most basic ones, plot as an element of fiction. Can anybody else throw any other ones at me? Any other ideas what we would include on the list here? Characters. Yep, absolutely. Character, very important one. Character. What else? Yeah. Conflict, yep. And I'm going to put conflict up here. I usually think of conflict as an extension of plot, but certainly as an aspect of plot, we want some kind of tension. We want some kind of driving force, right? What else?
Narration.
Sorry? Setting, yep. What is setting? Yeah, the when and the where of it, right? What else? What else do we have? What's that?
Narration.
Narration? Yeah, what do you mean by that exactly? What do you mean by narration?
Narrative voice.
That's the word I was looking for, yeah. And how would you describe that voice? How would you describe that?
The tone that used to convey the story.
Yeah, tone. I mean, you're throwing out another word I'm going to add on the list there. I'll clarify these in a second because actually, as it turns out, these are the 2 big things we're going to talk about when we're talking about style today that I want to talk about. We're talking about style. There's a lot of other things that are important. The 3 most important things before we move on specifically to style are these 3. Your plot, your characters, and your point of view. Point of view is one that often gets overlooked, but point of view, if you had to name one thing, it's this that's the most important thing. The point of view is foundational, fundamental to everything that you do. It determines how you're going to tell the story. It determines what's going to be revealed, how much we're going to know. It determines the plot. It determines the nature of the conflict. It determines your tone and your style, all of those things. Point of view is hugely important, but it's one of those decisions that we often arrive at sort of just on a whim when we start writing. I like writing in first person, I like writing in third person, and I'm going to be a little distant, or I'm going to be a little closer into their mind and have a lot of interiority, right? But when we get down the list, we get a lot of other things too. We get setting, we get voice tone, we get style is one of the things on the list, of course, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And we're going to define style in terms of voice and tone. We also have things like that I don't actually like to talk about a lot in class, like symbol and theme. That is in undergrad classes. In grad classes, it's most of what we talk about. But in an undergraduate class, I don't really like to talk too much about symbol and theme because they're things that tend to get more unearthed in the course of writing rather than chiseled out of stone ahead of time, right? And so I don't like it to, it's something this stuff is stuff we focus on a lot in literature classes, but not in workshops, not in creative writing workshops. Certainly not until you're kind of at that graduate level where it's the main thing you're thinking about, maybe. But anyway, I want to get back to this, and there's other things we can throw on the list, but I wanted to emphasize that when we're talking about style, we're talking about an aspect of fiction that you ought to be thinking about. But this is my thinking about style, because I was thinking about this earlier today as I was kind of prepping for this, and I was like, well, what can I say about my style? Like, what's my style? And like, I don't really know. Like I know it. Like if you gave me a story that I had read, that I had written, but somehow had forgotten I had written, I might say, oh, this sounds like it was written by me, but I don't know that I would necessarily be able to describe the style. Do you know what I'm saying? And so the notion of going and searching for a style or developing a style, I think is really best thought of as something that is contextually constructed and also thought about in different ways depending on what you're trying to do. And what I mean by contextually constructed is it depends on what story you're writing or perhaps even what scene you're writing, etc. So, style. How would you define style? When we say develop your style, how would you define style? Anybody? Language, certainly. That's also the first thing I think of when I think of style is the language that's being used. Any other characteristics?
Character development.
Character development. What else? I heard two different ones there. Do you guys keep talking at the same time? Did this happen on the last question too? Okay, it's something about gender, so I don't know what it is exactly. Yeah. Sentence structure, yeah. Which is part of the language issue, yeah. Syntax, yeah. I mean, I'm hearing some things that have a lot to do with language, and this is mostly what I want to focus on today. Yeah, do other people have something? Yeah, exactly. Themes is another one, right? We can recognize a writer often, they have a certain interest or a certain direction, certain sort of body of stuff that they like to write about, themes that they explore, and we can certainly consider that part of their style. I saw another hand here. Was that you? Did she take your answer? Oh, I took yours. Okay, I'm spacing out now. Anybody else? There are other things we can talk about, and tone is another thing that gets associated with certain writers. And even their genre choices, right? Especially in the literary, the genre stuff, and by genre we mean stuff that's more plot driven, and that is not necessarily slice of life realism, like most of the so-called literary writing was for the last half of the 20th century and the beginning of this one. But when we're talking about literary stuff today, that is stuff that's being published in literary journals or that gets reviewed in the New York Times or whatever, there's a lot of genre, right? Literary or so-called literary writers are investing a lot in so-called genre themes, right? They're writing speculative fiction, they're writing sci-fi, they're writing fantasy, they're writing fabulist stuff, absurdist stuff, all kinds of things. And when we talk about style, part of that is going to be these big ticket issues like themes and genres. But the interesting thing I want to point out here is that lots of different people can do those things, and we can recognize these big ticket things as an aspect of that person's personal style. But really, when it comes down to style, I'm going to make the argument today that what we're really talking about here is language. And that, yeah, while we can see certain stylistic tendencies in certain writers' writing, that really what it's about is the style that you're developing in the moment that you need those words, those particular words. So I want to use an example, and then we'll get back to this idea of voice and tone a little bit, and we'll explain a little bit more what those things are. When we think about style, there are a lot of, especially when thinking in a kind of the literary tradition, there are a lot of writers that kind of come to mind as, oh, that person has a very distinct style. And I'm going to pull a bin straight out of the white guy canon, apologies for that. But William Faulkner is one of the people that people talk about a lot as one of the canonical writers of the 20th century who had a really distinctive style. And if you want to see, like, I think sort of the epitome of what style looks like and what style means as it is a concept that we attach to a particular author, I recommend you read As I Lay Dying. Anybody read As I Lay Dying in here by William Faulkner? Read As I Lay Dying. It was written in 1930, a long time ago, but As I Lay Dying, it's a relatively short book. It's not as heady as some of his other books. Lots of different voices in it, lots of different modes of writing being used. And in addition to having characters who are speaking, you also have sometimes this kind of narrative voice that comes in and talks in a fancier way. But then there are stretches that are very stream of consciousness, kind of in the mind of the character. And I'm going to read you a couple examples here. This is why I brought the phone. So these are two different examples from the book, and this is kind of what I mean by style, okay, and how style isn't necessarily something that monolithically defines your writing, but rather it's a varied landscape that describes all the different kinds of tools that you can pull out at a certain moment. Does that make sense? I mean, the thing I was thinking about on the way over here when I was thinking about style is, and when I was thinking about like, man, what's my style? It was like, it's something that I would recognize in the mirror, but it's not a mirror I'm going to try to look in too much. I don't need to look in it. It's for other people to see my style and to talk about my style if they want to, if they feel like I have one. That's cool. For me, myself, it's more about, am I doing the right thing that feels good for me and what I'm trying to do in this moment for this story? And often, that has to do with two different things. And then I'll read these quotes for you. There's voice, which we've mentioned already. And voice, by the way, voice has two different meanings. The meaning of voice that I'm using particular here is character voice, okay? So it's a character's way of thinking and speaking. And again, you can see, obviously, that has everything to do with language, right? The way you're going to do interiority on the page, the way their thoughts are going to be represented, also their dialogue. That's all part of the voice of that character. The other meaning of the word voice can be closer to what we're talking about today in terms of your whole style. Voice can sometimes be used to apply to a writer. Oh, the writer's voice, they really found their voice. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about a character's voice, the voice of the character on the page. And then the other thing that came up earlier, which I'm going to argue is, again, these I think are sort of the two aspects of style to think about, right? This is the best way to think about your style because it's functional. It's not like, ooh, what kind of writer am I trying to be? It's more like, what do I need done on this page right now for the sake of this piece that I'm writing right now? So there's voice and then there's tone. How can we describe tone? We kind of took a stab at it, but let's give it another try. How can we describe tone? What's the tone of a piece? Anybody heard that word before? I mean, we have, but have you thought about what it really means? Yeah. Vocabulary, yes, sometimes vocabulary can be involved as a part of the language, for sure. Like if you have a kind of higher, like I'm saying higher, but more froofy language, all right? More purple prose, right? It feels a little different than if we have kind of more colloquial prose, common speak, yeah. Say it a little louder. How so? Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, I didn't put it on the list, but mood is another one of those things that we talk about as an element of fiction. And it's one of those things that you can talk to like 10 different experts on it, and they'll tell you 10 different things about what the difference between tone and mood is. But there is something, tone and mood are definitely very closely related. And I'll try to parse out the difference as I like to define it here in a second. I saw another hand up in back, yeah.
I was going to say feeling, but that's
Feeling? Yeah, it is. And in particular, this I think is the best way to think about tone. You'll see online, if you like go online and you try to find out like what tone, and this is something I tell my students all the time, like if you get online, you talk about tone. It's sort of like tone is supposed to express the writer's attitude or perhaps the character's attitude toward whatever's going on, right? And that's true, but I also think it's a little misleading as a function of expression, okay? Like, if we say that tone is the way the author feels about what's happening on the page, that's not quite right. It's, as an author, I don't feel like that's what I'm trying to do when I'm trying to create a tone. It's more like what I want you to feel. It's not necessarily my attitude. It's what I'm selling you or pushing you. Now, it might be also what I genuinely feel, but it might not. It might just be something that's inhabiting the character I'm writing about or the topic that I'm writing about. It might not be me, right? So I don't like really including that sense of, it's the way the author feels. So this, I think, is a better definition. It's the spirit with which the author wants you to take the moment, the story, the scene. So I want you to take the moment, the scene, the story, perhaps a character, right? And one of the words that I've lately started using a lot in class and in thinking about, when you're a writer and you teach writing, you think a lot about your own writing, but you also think a lot about just writing in general. And often, like I'll sometimes, to my detriment, and my wife gives me crap about this, I'll like start writing a story, and then I'll be like, ooh, this is exactly what I was trying to explain to my students. And then I'll like stop writing my story and make notes on what I'm doing, which is terrible for your writing. It's good for your teaching. It's not good for your writing. But one of the words that I've been busting out a lot in class, even if it's not necessarily something that I'm proactively thinking about as I'm writing, it is something that's happening in the back of my brain, which is I'm thinking a lot, and I'm going to write this like this, attitude, because attitude bridges both of these things, the character voice and then the overall tone of the story. So what is the character's attitude towards what's happening? What's the seeming attitude of the overall piece? And when we say tone is the spirit with which the author wants you to take the moment or the scene or whatever, some examples we can use is, we want you to take it very seriously. The tone is very somber, or it's skeptical, or it has an absurdist tone or a fabulous tone, right? If you have a story where somebody says something ridiculous, but everything else is happening serious, it seems to be quite serious, and the story can be quite jarring. There's a tonal sort of dissonance, right? You want that tone to be consistent, and ideally, especially when you're writing character-driven fiction, I would argue all fiction should be character-driven, no matter how good the plot, but assuming you're writing character-driven fiction, you should be thinking about the voice and ideally thinking about the tone, and these two things kind of hold hands to create what's going on there. And that overall thing is sort of your style. Now, really when we say your style, that's something you develop over time. Okay, style is something that you develop over time. But what's going to be more useful to you in like tonight, if you want to go home and write, or if you're working on something and you're going to work on it tomorrow or this weekend, what I really think is going to be helpful for you to think about is character. What's the character doing? What's going on? What do they want? What are they thinking? If you don't have a character, if you're writing nonfiction, even if you're writing poetry, who's the speaker in the case of poetry? Who's that persona in the case of nonfiction? What's the point of view from which that narrative is being spun? And what is its attitude towards the subject at hand? Is it neutral? Is it a little bit judgy? Is it welcoming? Is it hostile, right? All those things are part of what's going on, and they are a part of your overall style. Now, when we talk about style, again, this notion of language, we can look at specific authors and we can see specific things that they do that we would say are part of their style. So I'm going to go and point you out to two different moments in the book I was just mentioning, the Faulkner book, As I Lay Dying. Again, this came out in 1930, so it's been almost 100 years. And normally I would never teach books 100 years old in a creative writing class. But I'm teaching Faulkner right now because when you think of style, he's kind of one of the writers that leaps to mind. But normally in the class, like in a creative writing class at the University of Illinois, I don't teach any stories that are more than, I guess I teach Carver, so maybe 40 years old by now, 45 years old, but I don't really go any further back than that because I want people to be reading what's being written today, no matter what genre that is, whether it's romance, whether it's literary stuff, whether it's juvenile fiction, whatever it may be. Read what people are writing today. That's what you want to do. And having said that, I'm going to read you some quotes that were written 100 years ago. So this is, now these two sections here are both from the same character, or rather they're from chapters with the same, the way As I Lay Dying is structured is each chapter is named after a different character, and that character is the point of view character for that chapter. So these are both the same character, Darl, but you'll see they're very different styles because in the moment something different is being needed. In this first one, what you'll see, well, I don't want to over-characterize them too much. I'm going to read the first one, which is fairly short, and then the second one, which is much longer. The sun, and this is just a description in a section. The character's name is Darl. This is a description of the sun as he's having this conversation with a female character in the book. The sun, an hour above the horizon, is poised like a bloody egg upon a crest of thunderheads. The light has turned copper, in the eye portentous, in the nose sulphurous, smelling of lightning. We'll read it again. And I'm going to add the punctuation in here. The sun, comma, an hour above the horizon, comma, is poised like a bloody egg upon a crest of thunderheads. The light has turned copper. And then there's a colon. In the eye, portentous, the light that is. In the eye, portentous. In the nose, sulphurous, smelling of lightning. Weird phrasing, really strange sentence structure. Doesn't quite make sense. When you read the sentence the first time, you kind of have to stop and back up. And there's also in this next section a classic Faulkner thing that he does all the time. But you'll notice that this next section, also Darl, same character, but totally different style that you're going to hear here. Totally different mode of language here. This is Darl thinking about trying to fall asleep. In a strange room, you must empty yourself for sleep. And before you are emptied for sleep, what are you? And when you are emptied for sleep, you are not. And when you are filled with sleep, you never were. I don't know what I am. I don't know if I am or not. Jewel knows he is, because he does not know that he does not know whether he is or not. He cannot empty himself for sleep, because he is not what he is, and he is what he is not. Beyond the unlamped wall, I can hear the rain shaping the wagon that is ours, the load that is no longer theirs that felled and sawed it, nor yet theirs that bought it, and which is not ours either, lie on our wagon, though it does, since only the wind and the rain shape it, only to Jewel and me that are not asleep. And since sleep is not, and rain and wind are was, it is not. Yet the wagon is, because when the wagon was, Andy Bundren will not be. And Jewel is, so Addie Bundren must be, and then I must be, or I could not empty myself for sleep in this strange room. And so if I am not emptied yet, I am is. Now that's Byzantine, weird, right? Cycling thinking, somebody going round and round. A thought is or isn't. Jewel doesn't know what he is, and he's not, I guess, authentic in some way, and therefore he's not really what he is. He's something he isn't, but I'm trying to be what I am not, but am I? It's just kind of looping, right? Recursive thinking going on in his head. Very different from what we saw earlier, that description of the sun, with longer words, more punctuation in the section. The earlier section has almost as much punctuation as that long, more it's not stream of consciousness, but it's in that direction, right? And what you can see there is that he's actually using different aspects of style to do different things. When he wants to be out of the head and just sort of describe a moment, he gives this kind of lucid but beautiful and sort of weird description of the sun, right? And sort of the smell of lightning, the sulfurous smell of lightning, right? And the feel of it in the eyes, the description of it as a bloody egg, right? Resting atop the thunderclouds. As opposed to this, which is simple words, right? Talking about vocabulary and the language, much simpler words being used, much more sort of just obsessive thinking, going round and round a subject, but not a sentence you really have to stop and think about each word, even though in both sentences, in both these passages, I get a little lost. In both of these passages, I have to stop and think about, wait, what's he saying? What's he doing? How is this sentence constructed? And yet in completely different ways, okay? So when we're thinking about style and thinking about language, we're really thinking about the needs of that moment. Now, Faulkner, we can also point to Faulkner and talk about some other style habits he has. Part of the reason I brought up Faulkner, I will admit, is that I didn't start writing until later in life. I wrote a lot when I was a kid, but I just never did, you know. I think I had a lot of parents and teachers who were supportive, but I was never as good as I wanted to be, and so I didn't end up writing at all in my 20s, and then I didn't start writing again until I was in my 30s when I went back to school. And when I went back to school, all of a sudden I was reading all this stuff that I hadn't read before, and I was reading Faulkner. And, well, actually, I'll tell you a funny story real quick about style. If you want to develop your style without thinking about it, read the stuff you want to write. And it'll happen to you almost magically, by osmosis. If you read the stuff that you want to write like a lot, you'll start writing that way. And so this happened to me twice as I was learning to write. The very first writing class I took was, I went back to school at the age of like 31. I went to Parkland College and took a short fiction class there, just a literary class. And we read a bunch of romantic stuff, you know, so we were reading like Hawthorne and stuff like that. And I really dug it, you know, it's cool. But of course, this stuff's 200 years old. And so then I took a creative writing class from the same professor in the fall where I was like going to start writing stories. And I hadn't written stories in probably 15 years, didn't know if I could do it anymore. And I wrote the first story and I was like, oh man, this is good. It was so good. It was about this guy who had this girlfriend, or this girl he had a crush on, and she had this mysterious cat, you know, that would come and go, and it was this kind of mystery, but also like love story, and I thought it was so good. And I brought it to class on the first day of workshop, and I was like, this guy is going to be so impressed by my story. He's never seen anything like this before. And I brought it in. I'll never forget, it was my first workshop day, because we'd workshopped some of the other stories in class, right? And I was like, I got this. And we get to workshop my story, and he holds it up. Never forget, he holds it up and he goes, what the hell is this? And I was like, oh no, he's dragging me through the mud. And it was because I didn't know it at the time, because how was I going to know? I'd basically written a story in the style of Hawthorne. Like I'd written it with all this florid prose, right, and modifiers, you know, oh, the voluptuous, like, it, you know, it was dumb, and the prose was unreadable. But I didn't know any better, and so then I fixed it, and I was like, okay, I'll start reading more contemporary fiction instead of stuff that's really old and figure out what people are really doing. And so I solved that problem. But later on, I discovered Faulkner. I hadn't read him since high school, and I was like, oh, this is cool. I like this. But then I discovered that whenever I read Faulkner, I would start writing like him. Like I wouldn't even mean to. Like I would just start writing and I'd be like, all of a sudden I'm doing little things like, I don't know if you caught it, but or I might have mentioned it, but in one of those phrases he mentions, one of these passages I read, this word, unlamped, the unlamped wall. Well, that's not a word, unlamped. You can't say unlamped, but Faulkner's like, I'm gonna say unlamped. There's no lamp on the wall, it's unlamped. And so when I read Faulkner and then I write right after that, I find myself doing this, because he does this all the time. He makes up completely ridiculous made-up words, compound words often, like he's German or something, just shoving a bunch of words together to make a bigger word, right? He'll be like, you know, the porch side, one word. I'm like, porch side? What's porch side? But it works. And that's one of the things that when I read Faulkner, it like seeps into my own writing, like magically. I'm not even trying to do it. I'm not even necessarily conscious that I am doing it until I read it later on. So if you're thinking about developing your own personal style, I would say read the writers whose styles you admire, and when you think about your own style, don't do it too much, first of all, and also do it from a distance. If you do it from a distance, you're not going to be too concerned about what your overall style is or what somebody would say about your overall writing. So you're then looking at it from really far away, or if you really have to think about it, you want to do it with your nose to the paper. That's when you need to be thinking about style, and you want to be thinking about it in these terms, in terms of voice and tone. What's the voice of my character, which is driven very much by their attitude towards their lives, the people in the story, the situation that they're dealing with, right? Their attitude drives that voice, the way they express themselves, and then the tone. And you can sort of think as the difference between voice and tone as sort of the difference between, it's sort of like the way a character expresses themselves, and you can think of tone as kind of the way the story expresses itself, which is, of course, a movement of intention on the part of the writer. We are trying to convey something. We are trying to convey a particular tone. We don't necessarily start out writing something knowing what tone we're going for, but as we write our way into it, discover more about the character, discover more about their voice, or in the case of nonfiction, perhaps our own voice or the persona's voice, and then likewise we're allowing the tone of the story to develop. The fact that these two things happen so much hand in hand, especially when you have character-driven fiction, really, I think, helps explain why I'm breaking style down into these two parts. Because when you get to a story that's character-driven, and you're thinking about how that character talks and what the tone of the story is, those are the two things that are going to primarily determine the language and therefore the style of that piece. I'm going to pause there for a second. I have more to talk about in terms of voice and tone in particular, but any questions so far or comments about what's going on, what we're talking about? How much do you guys think about your language when you're writing? How much is it a big concern? And when in your process do you think about the language? That was a long question. How much do you think about your style or your language when you're writing?
But I was having a conversation with my she's a biologist, sometimes I get stuck on words. Anyways, she studies science for a living. And she was talking about when she writes research paper, how very strict she is to grammar and how very important is to follow the rules, right, for research papers, right? And I was talking about how I use words more like art, kind of, I see it more like you use it more fun.
Yeah.
Break the rules, break punctuation rules. So how do you, in your own personal writing, find balance between the two? Because your writing has to be understandable, and you want your reader to follow you, but at the same time, it's like a brushstroke, right? So how do you find that way to paint the flowers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's really hard to do that. And I think I like to illustrate the act of writing this way, and this maybe helps illuminate why it's so hard. The act of writing is taking the big jumbled mess of metaphors and other thinking that are floating around in your brain. That is the stuff that's sub-language. Thoughts aren't formed via language. Thoughts are formed via some more basic material that's below language. Only when we try to express ourselves and communicate with others do we formulate those thoughts into language. Right? So when we're writing, we're taking a bunch of jumbled mass of ideas in our brain, abstract things, ideas, inspirations, images that we've taken from other fictional sources or real sources, and then we're trying to formulate those down. This is the picture I draw for my students in class. This is what writing really is. There's this big mess of stuff over here in your brain, right? All these squiggly things and towers and people who are mad or whatever, right? And all this stuff is going, and then you're going to write a story. But this, of course, is a big, huge, immeasurable space. Writing is not. It is by definition finite, that is on the page. Writing is, in fact, the human act of taking thought and putting it into a concrete form so that other humans can understand our thoughts. That's what language is. It's a rudimentary thought translator for each other, right? So when we're writing, we're trying to scrunch all this big messy stuff down into this tiny, tiny little formalized box called a story or an article or whatever, so that other humans can come by and by the same standardized rules of English in our case, they can read that. And then there's another side to it, which is, of course, it balloons out to something on this side, and it's going to have some of the same kind of stuff in it, but it's also going to have some weird stuff that you didn't intend as a writer, because that's what art should do. It should be more than you intended. You just made it rich enough that other people can bring their own stuff to it, right? So when you think about writing in terms of this, that you're like trying to scrunch this down, what that means is that right after you write something, you're the least qualified person in the world to know how good you did. Because you know what you meant to do. You were attuned with all this. Nobody else was. All they have is this little box right here where the words that you committed to paper or to digital paper and sent it along, right? So when you're thinking specifically about the words that you're using and how do I write in a way that's compelling and interesting and perhaps challenging, right? Or at least engaging for the reader, while also being clear. And the answer is, it takes time and help. Right? There's two big things you can do for your own writing in terms of trying to solidify the style you're going for, the language you want to use, is one, you can forget what you were trying to do and work with what you did. And then you can listen to other people who have no idea what you were trying to do, but are only looking at what you did. And this is why in workshops we often have, they call it the gag rule, which I don't like. But there's a reason why we have the gag rule. It's because if you write a story or a poem and you send it off somewhere and it's then in a magazine that somebody's going to read at home, you don't get to go to their room and explain it to them. You don't get to explain this word or the convoluted sentence that you wrote or why you're using this style. The story has to explain itself. The piece has to explain itself. And so the more thinking you can do on this, the two big things again are time. Spend time. I mean, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll do a draft and I'll leave it seriously for a year, like a single story. I'll write a 20-page story or maybe the first page of a story and then I don't know what's happening and I'll leave it for a year and then I come back and do it again. So the biggest thing you can do is give yourself a lot of time to forget all this, or at least to forget the stuff that you don't need anymore to make this good. Focus on this and then listen to all the people who are reading it and giving you feedback and decide what parts of that feedback are valuable for you to revise your language, for you to revise your piece, and what parts are not necessarily, all right? But remembering that writing is an act of trying to convey something in a very rigid form that was born in a very amorphous, abstract form, I think is helpful to understanding the challenge that we have in using language. It's kind of an amazing feat, actually, that we're able to do it at all. For me personally, I don't know if that's answering your question, but for me personally, I find that I overwrite. So I write too fancy, and I've just learned to let myself do that and know that I will come back later, as will my wife and my agent or whoever else I ask to read it, and help me get that under control. But I don't like to slow myself down too much in the heat of generative writing, that is creative writing, when I'm actually creating something new. I don't like to slow myself down too much by parsing over my language, because it can disrupt the flow of other things that are important. So I would say when it comes to language, how to find that balance, revision, 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 time and help. Does that kind of, that was a very long-winded answer to your question, sorry. Yeah, sure, of course.
What advice would you take for new writers or people who maybe stopped writing and then started writing again to get that help? Like they don't have like classes or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you start with friends, right? There's also a lot of online places where you can share work, online communities where you can share work with other people. If you can find community classes or community groups, that's a good place to start. I know a lot of people that I went to school with. By the time you go to school for creative writing and you've had a bunch of workshops, you're kind of over it. Like when I had my last workshop as a grad student, I was like, bye. I can't wait to be out of that scene. I had been in workshops for years. And some people, when they left the program, still wanted that. And I know a lot of people who left the school and they would go out and either find or sometimes even start their own writing groups. And the key is to find people whose opinion is going to be helpful and valuable. And what I mean by that is helpful in terms of they're going to be mean to you, right? And valuable in terms of they understand what you're trying to do. They're not just they're swinging in there with loose criticism, but they're coming in understanding at least vaguely what you're trying to do. So that's what I'm always looking for in a reader. Because if I send it to a friend who I know doesn't really like my writing, well, he's not my audience anyway, right? He doesn't dig that, so I'm not going to bother. But I also am not just going to send it to like my dad, who's going to be like, "Good job, son." You know, that's not helpful. I need the criticism to move forward.
I'd just like to put in a plug for a critique group that I belong to.
Oh yeah, great.
We're local, but we meet on Zoom, and it started from one of these.
Yeah, people meet, and what's the name of the group? Does it have a name?
Talk to me afterwards.
Does your group have a name? Not officially. Yeah. Nice. Yeah, that's great. I mean, these are the kinds of places where you can meet people who are interested, and it's really helpful just to have other people look at your work. You know, in a classroom setting, it can be kind of weird because it feels judgy and there's grades attached. The one thing that I've seen that I think is really valuable and harder to find in a community group is try to find somebody who's going to be mean to you. And I hate to say that, but you know, whenever I have a student who brings in a story and they're like, "Oh, you know, people have really liked it," and I'm like, "Who'd you show it to?" And they're like, "Oh, my mom and my boyfriend." And I'm like, "Well, if they didn't tell you they liked it, they're not very nice, right? They should tell you it was good. That's what your mom and your boyfriend are supposed to do. You want to find somebody who's going to tell you the truth, right? And be able to see it, which a mom or somebody close to you who, you know, is just impressed maybe that you finished a story, you know, that's not necessarily helpful criticism. You want somebody who's going to dig into it. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, this is a specific question. So I find that whenever I'm writing and I start describing a setting, the voice becomes very disjointed from the narrating character's voice, often culminating in paragraph-long sentences with tons of semicolons.
Sorry, I'm so thirsty. I was drinking. I didn't hear the last half of that sentence.
Often culminating in paragraph-long sentences with semicolons.
Oh, why? Because you're describing scenes, or? Oh, yeah, yeah.
Or it's a high fantasy setting that's not something I...
Yeah.
What's a good way to avoid doing that and staying in voice while narrating a complicated setting?
This is a third-person problem, I take it.
Yes.
Right. So, yeah, this is another thing about style that's really important to keep in mind. And I'll throw this up here just because I don't very often get the opportunity to say this to people who aren't, you know, my captive students in a U of I classroom. You guys are here voluntarily. I guess they're there kind of voluntarily, but. Crap, what were we talking about? I just totally spaced.
Describing settings in a third person.
Oh, yeah. First person, right. First person, so, yeah, right. First person is pretty straightforward, okay? And a lot of times we think about first person, like when we think about point of view, we're making a choice between first person and third person, and maybe if we were cool, we're doing second person, right? That's not what it is, okay? There's first person, which is pretty straightforward. Lots of voice, it's me, I, right? This is not news to anybody. But third person, the notion that, you know, there's first person and then third person, no. There's first person and then there's third person. Because third person is way, way more complicated than first person. Way more complicated. And the main reason why third person is more complicated is because there's many different modes. There are subtle different modes you can talk about in first person, like first person, plural, and stuff like that. But generally speaking, in third person, there's, this is kind of what I want to try to quickly get across. You can think of third person as being of three kinds. Okay, objective, limited, and omniscient. And it all has to do with minds, and in particular, how many minds you have access to. An objective point of view, which we almost never see because it's really boring. There are some short stories that do it. Hills Like White Elephants, famous, what's his name story, Hemingway story, is pretty much in third person objective. No minds, no interiority. You don't have access to what anybody's thinking. It's just people talking, scenery, setting, that kind of stuff. Limited means you have access to one mind. This is common, and we see this a lot in novels and short fiction, where it's third person, it's he, she, they, but it's, you know, we just have access to one character's thoughts, right? Then we have omniscient, and this is where it gets really complicated. Omniscient can be many minds. Now, what's tricky about this is any given piece can move between these different modes. We don't very often see books that combine third and first, although it's happened. I don't particularly love it. But these different forms of third person we combine a lot. And I think what you're talking about is you can have a character-driven thing where it's limited and, oh, you know, Sean saw this and he walked down the cobblestone road and did whatever. But then we can also have an omniscient voice. Now, when we say many minds, here's what's tricky about this. It can kind of come in two different flavors. One, you can have it shifting between many different minds. That's not really omniscient. That's just a shifting limited. Now we're with Bob, now we're with Sean, now we're with Carol, right? That's what's going on. But in every case, maybe each chapter we're moving to a different mind. But you can also have what's called a disembodied narrator. And that's something that we do often see in fantasy, is we have a disembodied narrator who's kind of telling us how things are, telling us what's going on, right? Meanwhile, in the land of such and such far away, that's a disembodied narrator. That disembodied narrator is a presence that's in the story, but isn't bodied as a character. And yet you can feel someone. I like to call it a universal storyteller, or what I often call it in classes, a storytelling narrator, the storytelling narrator. They're kind of telling things that no one person in the story knows. So the trick to that is, first of all, recognizing that you have these different modes, and that trying to shift from limited, where you're in a lot of interiority, to a more disembodied mode where you have kind of a disembodied narrator that's telling us how things are. That's okay. You just got to manage those transitions. And usually what we'll see is structures that we're familiar with. We start off with a narration that's disembodied, right? And it's like, oh, over the mountains, and then we zoom in on the town, and here's the young lass or whoever, and then all of a sudden we're following them, right? That character. That's pretty normal. What's important for you to recognize is that when your readers are reading your story, when they're reading your style, trying to deal with your structure, your language choices, they're drawing upon the experience of all the stuff they've read before you, just as you are when you're writing. And so if you pay attention to how other writers are handling these things, right? Read some fantasy and pay attention specifically. Well, how did they do that? Because I see this stretch here has a lot of interiority, a lot of emotion from my character. But over here in this stretch, there's no mention of my character. It's just describing the town or the land or an event from the past or whatever. We'll take a look at how they did that, because that's something writers think about all the time. I've got a conversation here is a big one. And yet, even though I've got a third-person limited story, when these people start talking, I totally lose my interiority. I don't get into anybody's head because I've been so busy thinking about dialogue. Well, if that's an issue, and if the style that you're going for at this moment demands more interiority from your character, go back to that conversation and insert some, right? If the description of the scenery feels too florid and too disconnected from your character, find a way to fit that character into the moment, or decide that you need to have a better transition and you want to keep that description clean and find a way to separate it out from that different narrative mode. So the thing about third person is just to remember that it's way more complicated. You have way more choices, but also a much bigger tool bag to use, because you can shift back and forth between these modes. And in fact, if you pay close attention to a lot of the novels and stories you've read, you'll see writers doing, in fact, that exact thing. And you can look and see, well, how'd they do that? How'd they manage that exact thing? Other questions about that? Any other questions? Yeah.
I just had a question about words.
Yeah.
I love it when I'm reading a book and I come across a word I haven't heard before.
Yeah.
I have to look it up. And then I want to use that by writing.
Yeah.
Is that a good idea? I mean, do you want your readers to have to work that hard?
I like big words, personally, and I also like to make up words. So I'm a believer in using a thesaurus. I recommend that there's an online thesaurus called Super Thesaurus, I think is what it's called, or Wonder Thesaurus or something. Anyway, it's the one I use. It's got a lot of annoying ads, but it's a great one because it will find all the related words. So I use them all the time. And it's not so much because I'm trying to find a word I didn't know. It's because I'm trying to find a specific word that I can't quite get. You know, English has more words than any other language in the world. English because we're a kind of a mongrel language. We pull from so many other languages. Huge number of words in the English language, which is great. If you're a writer of English, it's not so great, I think, if you're trying to learn English, but as a writer of English, it's great to have so many choices. So, you know, don't use words where you're not sure what they meant. I'll tell you another story real quick. You guys know who David Foster Wallace is? Okay, so David Foster Wallace, a famous writer, and he used to live here in the area, and has played tennis here. And his mom was a teacher at Parkland, and I didn't know that, but I was kind of a David Foster Wallace fan at the time. And here I am taking his mom's class, and I didn't know it. Sally's her name, Sally Wallace, and I'm taking her class, and I had no idea. And about halfway through the semester, someone was like, "That's David Foster Wallace's mom," and I was like, "What?" So then I'm all nervous. So for the final project in the class, I asked her if I could write a story instead of a research paper, because I don't like writing research papers. She was like, "Sure, you can do a creative project." So I did. It was something about New Orleans, race relations in New Orleans. And I used the word akimbo. And I'll never forget, I was like, "Oh yeah," because it just sounded nice. And I don't remember the sentence, but I used the word akimbo. And Sally Wallace was like, "That is not the proper usage of that word." She schooled me. And it clearly was schooling me because I was going for that $20 word, right? I was going for a big word and didn't quite have it under control and used it wrong. So that's always really embarrassing. So I would say don't go for big words that are beyond you, but if you can try to find a word, and that happens to me, I'm just like, that word, I don't know what that means. But if you can try to find a word that means exactly what you want it to mean, that's a good use, I think, of a thesaurus and that kind of thing. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's, I would say this too, okay, just another thing about style and language in general. Very often when I'm talking to my students, I see that they really think of writing as very much being about the language. And it might be weird for me to say to you, after all this, that it's kind of not. But it's kind of not. It is about the language, and ideally you have some skills with language and can put together some killer sentences. But more than that, it's about stitching the story together. And it's about writing well in a way that allows your writing to not interfere with the other magical things that you're doing. Now, if you're somebody like me, you're also trying to have your language emphasize the story. I am a wordsmith. I think I'm that kind of, just poked myself in the eye. I'm a wordsmith and I think about it that way, but not every writer is. And there are times when I work on a story and that's actually not what I'm thinking. I'm not thinking about my words. I'm thinking about the tone or the mood or the themes or, whatever it is. So it's really a matter of what you want your focus to be for the particular thing that you're writing, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Yeah.
Not a question, but a recommendation.
Yeah.
So as far as an online thesaurus, I really like Word Hippo.
Oh, Word Hippo.
Yeah, so I love it because it has, the thesaurus, but it also has antonyms. It'll give you definitions.
Oh, cool.
And it'll give you sample sentences, everything right there, and there are almost no ads.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's nice.
And it's very clean to use and very user-friendly. So definitely.
Yeah. I like a good thesaurus. Sometimes I'll pick a word just because it sounds cool or it has the right number of syllables, and I have to make sure it means right. But sometimes I'll go in and I'll use a word and I'll look up the etymology of a word and I'll think, oh, I like the source of that. I like, the root of this word. I discovered a really fascinating thing the other day. The roots of the word, I'm not 100% sure this is true, but I think it is. The roots of the word, what the most common verb in the English language is? Anybody know what it is? I just used it 3 times.
To be.
Yeah, to be. And to be has 8 conjugations. It's the same word, to be. Anybody know what the 8 conjugations of to be are? Can we figure them out?
Am, is, or, was, were, be, being, been.
There they are. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been. It's all the same word, be. So I discovered the other day, or I read the other day, that that verb, which is our most essential verb, but also our most boring, right? It means something is. You can't even really define it. What does it mean to be? Well, something is. You have to use other forms of to be to define to be. But the original word of the root of the word to be, I think, is a Sanskrit maybe word, ba, which is breath. And then the roots of the word is and am both go all the way back to words for grow. Think about that when language was first being developed, the notion of something growing or something breathing was just part of the world, right? That people experience. Be, it grows, it breathes. And roots and those words developed into the complex kind of conjugated word we have today. The point being, if you have a good reason for using a word, it might be personally yours. Sometimes I will pick a word just because I looked up the etymology and I was like, oh, that's neat. But I don't expect anyone else to necessarily know that or make that connection. It was just fun for me. So for me, part of my style is sometimes just doing a little wordplay, that's fun for me that I don't even know if people are necessarily going to appreciate, and that frankly probably sometimes detracts from the other stuff. So I'm guilty sometimes of letting my language and my style get in the way of the other stuff that I'm trying to do, the story I'm trying to tell, the characters I'm trying to develop. So this is part of why I'm encouraging you not to look in this particular mirror too much. Yeah, be cognizant of your style, but think of it more in terms of what you need to do in that particular moment, right? And swing for that particular fence. Use those particular tools to do the thing you want to do. Because if you're just trying to push things and sound fancy and sound like a writer, this is completing the thought I was going to say earlier, and then I'll wrap it up here. I get so many students, especially men, I'm going to say, in class, who they're like, I'm a writer. And then they turn in something like the first story I turned in for my workshop, which is like, I'm a writer, and all this very florid prose and flowery stuff. And I'm like, but if you look at writers, like, they don't really do that. Sorry. People writing 100 years ago did, but contemporary writers don't. So don't write that way. Anyway, any other questions? Any last questions before we wrap it up? Yeah.
On that subject of etymology, do you think of using the archaic form of a word or using archaic words in a way to convey the age of a setting or the age of
So my question was, using sort of archaic words or old-fashioned words, like to sort of help create the tone, I would think, and world build, etc. Only if you think it's worth the risk, because everything that you do, everything that we insert into a story, there's always that risk of authorial intrusion. You guys know what authorial intrusion is? It's the experience that a reader has when they're reading a book and all of a sudden they're conscious that somebody wrote it. And it's usually for a bad reason. You're not sucked into the story. Reading, all of a sudden you're like, wait, what? What is they trying to say? I don't understand this sentence they wrote. That's authorial intrusion. It's like the author is suddenly going, hi, I wrote this. And you're like, whoa, you're kind of kicked out of the story there. So if you feel like you can use those words in a way that isn't going to draw attention to the fact that you're using them, but instead is going to feel like an organic, it's another big word, organic part of the story, the better off you are. Anyway, any other questions? I think we can wrap it up here. Yeah? Thank you all so much for having me. It was a fun night. I appreciate you having me here. Thanks to you, to Salem, for inviting me.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. A big thank you to Ted for leading such an insightful workshop. Thank you. Just a reminder, we'll be back in this room on August 16th, and that will be the workshop Solving Your Story Problems. So that will be a group brainstorming session, and author Ekta Garg will help you. So if you're stuck on a story, she'll help you identify those trouble spots and move forward from them. So hope to see you there. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.